Alright, guys, just a fair warning. This chapter and the next four chapters, I think, are pretty long and are going to take quite a while for me to read through them. But I think that I will read through the whole chapter just to give those that want the book in its totality a chance to actually listen to the chapter. But I think, like, honestly, the best way to do this chapter is maybe to listen to the reaction on Thursday. Um, but yeah, let's give it a go. All right, the title of this chapter is PTSD, Mental Illness and Depression. All right, here we go. The denial of responsibility is the root cause of a majority of mental, physical, and emotional problems that people experience in life. We create our own reality. Without our input at every moment in our lives, the world as we perceive it would cease to exist. Although this concept may be difficult to conceptualize, it is extremely important to understand. If you had not chosen to read these words at this exact moment, the world would be different. You reading these words now is necessary for the world to exist as you perceive it. It was not your fault. These words are some of the most misleading, negatively affecting, false, and overall damaging words that can ever be said to someone. Whether it is a soldier coming back from a war in which things happened that are hard to explain, or a young woman who has been sexually abused by her uncle, or the struggles of young parents who have recently lost their only child in a brutal car crash. The reality of any situation is that in some way every person has contributed to the result. However, in entering this discussion, it is extremely important to differentiate between the terms fault and contribution. There is no discussion of fault within these paragraphs. The discussion centers wholly on how we, as humans, contribute to the reality we create. If the soldier had not been riding alongside their best friend in the same armored Humvee at the exact time the roadside IED ripped a hole where their friend used to be sitting, the situation could not have happened as it did. The soldier's friend may have died, but the situation would not have been the same. If the young parents were not driving their car down the highway at the exact time the other car swerved into their lane, their baby would not have died. Although this concept may be difficult to accept, we contribute to the reality we create. We are responsible for every moment and every action of our lives, whether or not we want to accept this fact. It is difficult to accept this concept as true. If it is difficult to accept this concept as true, or one simply does not want to accept it as true, it will prove impossible to assume responsibility for one's life. Although we are quick to accept responsibility for our own accomplishments, we are usually somewhat reticent, if not loath, to accept responsibility when things go wrong. If our successes belong to us, so must our failures, and the situations which we may wish to relieve are beyond our own control. The fact is that we can create neither success nor failure, good nor bad, without our own input, our own thoughts, and our own actions that lead to a result. The importance in understanding this concept becomes very clear in how we choose to deal with traumatic events after they happen. The soldier, who unfortunately was witness to the death of their best friend in an act of war, has a choice of how to proceed with their life after the event has occurred. The soldier can choose to deny the reality of the event and try to bury the images, feelings, emotional chaos, and overarching uncertainty about life that an event like this is sure to create. Or the soldier can choose to accept the perceived reality of the situation and that they personally contributed to this event. If the soldier chooses to accept or deny the reality of the situation, PTSD is a very real possible consequence of such a traumatic situation. However, the ability to move toward health requires an acceptance that the event happened and that the soldier was a part, and not only a part, but a contributing factor. A denial of any aspect of the situation or one's own contribution to the event will always leave some issues of the situation unresolved. The suppression and often outright denial of the perceived reality that surrounds us is often one of the more developed coping mechanisms that many of us use. However, the denial of, or the inability to accept, responsibility for the world around us is the number one cause of all mental illnesses and psychological maladaptive behaviors. We do not get to pick and choose the realities we accept. unless, of course, we want to create our own mental deficiencies. If one looks at any mental illness, as it might be defined in the DSM-5, from obsessive compulsive disorder to depression to severe psychoses or anything in between, there is a continuing theme in every case in which the person who may suffer from the disease is trying in some way to alter the reality which they perceive. The efforts to try and alter, suppress, or deny the perceived conceptual reality that surrounds an individual is an inability to accept responsibility for this reality. Although each of us create our own reality, if we are not able to learn or develop the abilities to accept this reality, we will use whatever skills we do possess to try and create a reality we can accept. Mental illness occurs when we find ourselves unable to accept responsibility for the world we perceive, and we try to create a world for which we can accept responsibility. Or if by creating this modified world, we think we can relieve ourselves of responsibility. In this way, mental illness should not really be looked at as an illness at all. Trying to create a situation for which one can assume responsibility is actually an attempt to create a solution to a perceived problem or situation for which one cannot assume responsibility. If trying to create a solution to a situation that proves difficult to accept makes one ill, is there any among us who would not fall into this category? Should a person suffering from depression really be considered ill? A person suffering from depression, whether mild or severe, has perceived some aspect of their life for which they cannot accept responsibility. As an example, I once suffered from a severe depression in high school because I became physically and mentally unable to actually finish the homework I was assigned. It had nothing to do with my mental ability to actually finish the homework, but rather with my own idea that I could not accept the fact that I might not know all the answers, or worse, that I would make a mistake in my work, and my friends and teachers would realize that I was not as smart as I pretended myself to be. I was simply not able to accept the reality that students do make mistakes and are not expected to know the answers. To avoid this reality, I dropped out of school, pretending that school was just boring and that I hated it. I created a reality that I could accept. Am I ill? Because at times in my life I feel nervous and scared, and there are many situations which still prove difficult for myself to assume responsibility. The important thing to realize about mental illness today is that in almost all the medical journals and psychology magazines, mental illness is something that needs to be cured. In actuality, many diagnosed mental illnesses are an attempted cure created by the individual. In the mind of an individual who is suffering from some mental illness, any actions taken are an attempt to create a solution to a perceived problem. If we, as a society, want to try and help those with diagnosed mental illness, it is not necessary to cure the mental illness, but rather help them develop skills that are needed by the individual so that they can create, accept, and function acceptably within the reality that is generally agreed upon by society at large. All right, that's it. If you made it this long, thanks, man. You're a trooper. Have a great day. Bye-bye. See you in the next one.